When someone knocked on my door, I immediately went to open it, even though it was 3 in the morning. I felt like I knew who was there. The relationship with my girlfriend was complicated to the extent that we often parted ways with harsh words, claiming it was forever, only to reconcile later with promises never to quarrel again. Jealousy played a role, resulting in overly emotional interactions during the day. Alice packed her things and moved out after a knock on the door. Initially, I thought she had second thoughts about our relationship, but I was ready to forgive and reconcile. As I reached for the key and turned it, there was another strange knock, unfamiliar and too light. It wasn't Alice. I released the key and asked who was there, receiving only heavy breathing in response. I repeated the question, yet only silence followed, accompanied by raspy sighs akin to agony. Something's wrong. Can't say a word, I thought, and peered through the peephole, only to find darkness, intentionally closed to conceal the identity of the person outside. Anger surged within me, fists clenched. I debated between opening the door and confronting whoever it was or maintaining composure. "You have a minute to leave, or I'll deal with this right here," I warned. And they heard me. The footsteps shuffled away, and the agonizing breaths receded, leaving me on the verge of exhaustion. I wanted to sleep. The day had drained me with arguments. I lay down and dozed off, not recalling until the next morning when I ventured into the hallway. The peephole wasn't merely covered, it was sealed with a clump of clay-like soil. Regret washed over me as I cleaned the door. Our building, an old one, housed diverse people. Some had succumbed to alcohol and other substances, mentally deteriorating into walking, sick organisms. However, I never had issues with them before. They used to roam around without bothering anyone or occasionally sleep in the bushes near the entrance. Now they went as far as sealing my peephole with soil. I vowed that the next time they approached, they would face consequences. The very next night, a knock echoed on my door again. It wasn't even a sound. It was more like scratching, as if someone was clawing at the lock, attempting to pull it out with their nails. The peephole was covered again, and though I was angered, I tried not to get too worked up. It was still unclear who was behind the door and what their intentions were. The scratching persisted, accompanied by raspy breathing. It took me a moment to realize that I was nervously biting my lower lip. Fear was starting to take hold, making it unwise to blindly open the door without knowing who was there. I struck the door with my fist to dislodge whatever was covering the peephole. Success. A small round opening allowed light to seep through. The glass remained somewhat dirty, preventing a clear view of the person in the hallway. Nevertheless, I could assess the level of threat. A thin and short individual, unsteady on their feet, struggling to hold their head straight. I grabbed a mop from the bathroom. I didn't want to touch them with my hands in case they turned aggressive or carried some infection. After all, they were all carrying bouquets. Cursing, I turned the lock and forcefully pushed the handle, hoping to knock the intruder down and then add a swipe with the mop. However, my fingers went limp when I saw who was standing before me. It couldn't be a living person. Dehydrated, eyeless, naked, their skin resembled polished copper, shiny and reddish. Not a single hair on their body, and every inch of flesh appeared to be a continuous scar from burns. This is how a person would look if doused in gasoline and set on fire, yet miraculously survived. A living agony. The person breathed with an open mouth, feeling the wall, attempting to grasp the air, wrinkling their nose, and moving their ears in a futile attempt to compensate for blindness. Witnessing this, I almost physically felt their torment. I retreated into my apartment to avoid seeing this pitiful sight, and probably they didn't want me to see them either, sealing my peephole. They were genuinely capable of terrifying anyone. One might mistake them for a monster or a ghoul. I was still hoping for rational answers, expecting that these seemingly helpless blind individuals could live underground. However, Jake, my neighbor, shattered these illusions when he explained that they emerged from the collapsed earth near the wall, leaving dirty traces and blocking the peepholes with clay. The realization sank in. These were not humans. They were a peculiar, unexplained phenomenon, and we had to deal with it ourselves. Jake, with a red nose and chilled fingers, emphasized that we needed to keep the doors locked at night, especially when dealing with these dry, lifeless creatures. Though I was still processing this information, he assured me that we would handle it ourselves. It seemed they never encountered anything like this before, and the fear within me grew as the nightly knocks and nail sounds resumed, becoming impossible to ignore. Judging by the sounds, my door wasn't just scratched, it was torn apart, opened like a can with a can opener, pieces ripped off as if with a knife. I hoped it wasn't so, thinking that the long corridor acted like a megaphone, amplifying the sounds. Nevertheless, it was terrifying. Thankfully, Alice left me in time and didn't witness this. The blind intruder was breathing heavily and relentlessly digging into my door. It seemed like a bit more, and it would break. This continued for a whole hour, and when I couldn't bear it any longer, it suddenly stopped. I knew the blind one had left, but I was afraid to open the door until it was time to leave my apartment. What I saw in the morning was a shredded canvas, deep grooves on jagged metal, and bite marks on steel sheets. My door was flimsy, and they nearly pierced it through. Only the last layer remained intact, and I chose to ignore it for the time being. Jake's door was sturdier, but even there, they tore off the handle. They managed to break into one apartment, a family's old wooden door, snapping it into pieces. When a couple with a child fled through the window, the horrific trio roamed the rooms, feeling and overturning things. Eventually, they found a clothes cupboard and stole some clothing. However, that wasn't all that happened that night. There was an old man in our building. I couldn't remember his patronymic name, but he was sturdy and healthy, with blue veins visible. It seemed he had experienced a similar break-in during the night, but he didn't immediately share what had happened in his home. He shouted at Jake, telling us not to meddle in his affairs. However, he changed his mind, called us over, and spilled the entire story. When one of the blind ones entered your room, the old man, without hesitation, grabbed a stool and began beating the uninvited guest. The stool broke, and the intruder hit the floor, seemingly lifeless. He didn't know what to do. It seemed like he had killed a human, but wasn't sure what consequences awaited him. Dragging the lifeless body into the room, he contemplated his next steps. Suddenly, the blind one noisily inhaled, twitched, cracked his joints, readjusted his dislocated shoulders, stood up, and simply walked away. The immortal blind ones emerged from under the ground. What were they? I desperately wanted to know what we were dealing with. I knew a person who could help us. My friend Kate. She studies history and genealogy, working with archives to find information about ancestors, searching for forgotten gravesites. I immediately wrote to her, not revealing too much, just asking if she could look into the archives for any information about the place where I live. Kate responded promptly, mentioning that she had been interested in this building before, but there was no information about it. It was an old barracks later converted into residential apartments. No one knew what it was used for before that, as the documents were classified, and none survived. My friend, sensing my deeper interest, understood that I wasn't asking casually. I had to tell her about the collapsed earth near the building and the extraordinary events happening now. In an instant, Kate called back, asking me to show her the location. She had already arrived, and seeing the pit, she claimed it was a mass grave. She secured a safety line to the nearest pole and descended. After a few minutes, she resurfaced, showing me a piece of rusty chain. "The dead are not chained," she said. Lacking sufficient information, my imagination started filling in the gaps. An old barracks, unethical experiments seeking immortality, victims of inhumane experiments, attempts to destroy their own creations, blinded, burned alive, buried alive. I shuddered at my own thoughts. Truth eluded us. Night approached, and many had broken doors. We needed to decide what to do. The experience of our elderly neighbors showed that they could be temporarily immobilized. The residents armed themselves with whatever heavy objects they could find. Jake took an axe, and it surprised me that everyone around was fueled with anger and excitement. For me, it wasn't enjoyable. One blind intruder had managed to pierce and chew through my door. I wasn't eager to confront those capable of such acts, so I decided to be on standby and offer assistance when necessary. It grew dark. My neighbors stood guard in the hallway and on the street, creating an atmosphere of tense anticipation. I sat in my apartment with the doors securely locked, although the last layer could be pierced, and I was contemplating whether to open it or not. The commotion, chaos, and shouts erupted. My adrenaline surged again in moments of danger. Duty toward my fellow residents compelled me to step outside. It turned out that several unsecured boards without eyes blocked the dead-end corridor, and people were emerging from under the floorboards. Among them were both naked and partially dressed individuals, all appearing dehydrated and burned. Some lacked noses and ears. The corridor became impassable. Neighbors fought them, and the eyeless ones fell, unable to straighten their backs before being subdued. They lay still, not moving or breathing. Under the loose boards was an empty well that existed before the installation of plumbing. That's where the eyeless ones made their nest, hiding during the day. There were 8 of them. Neighbors hurriedly deliberated on what to do with them when, surprisingly, Jake suggested tying them up and throwing them back into the well. We spent the entire night hauling buckets of sand to concrete the old well. I felt uneasy about being involved in this act and found myself entangled in the unknown. I don't know who those blind beings were. Perhaps they couldn't be considered human. Yet they seemed monstrously unhappy, having spent decades, maybe even a century, underground. Surely they felt something. Perhaps they were cold, seeking clothes, and we buried them beneath layers of concrete. Alice wanted to reconcile, but I told her it was better for her not to return to me. There was no energy left for passionate relationships. I slept poorly at night, and one night I heard scratching, not at the door, but from below. Someone rustled quietly beneath the floorboards. Night after night, my neighbors and I greeted each other, but didn't talk. I didn't know if it was one or multiple individuals, but they drew nearer each night, the sounds growing louder, like mice gnawing, and then a crackling of stones. Strangely, I almost got used to the noise beneath the floor, thinking it would be perpetual. I didn't listen to my inner voice or my friend Kate, who advised me to leave. I had plenty of problems, and in my nervous state, I couldn't even consider moving. It was the last night in that house. I lay there in the grip of a heavy sleep, alone with my illness. Scratching and scrabbling from below persisted, teeth grinding, and I thought I heard wheezing. My hand hung from the bed, and I felt a draft through the gap. Then the floorboards creaked. The air rose into my room, and there it was, roaring, flailing its arms. Nails snagged my leg, tearing the skin. Wrapped in a single blanket, I fled from my own apartment through the window. The blind one had only partially emerged. Otherwise, he wouldn't have let me go, and I wouldn't have coped with him. I have no doubt. That night, it happened not just in my apartment. Buried alive, they gnawed through the concrete, found their way under the floor, and even blind, they managed to locate all the apartments they previously sought. They entered Jake's, Tom's, the former convicts, and other neighbors' homes, and no one could defend themselves. The blind ones became angrier, displaying their brute strength, tearing all my neighbors to shreds. They literally led me to the morgue for identification. The old man had no face. His body had been gnawed to the bones. Only his hands and feet survived. I recognized him only by his blue tattoos. Later, they showed me a refrigerator containing Jake's remains, his head, neck, a piece of the right shoulder, and the arm. Some parts of other neighbors were also left. I never returned to that house. They wouldn't have let me, and now it's a restricted area. The survivors were relocated, now residing in one of the cheap, New buildings with sandwich panels. Rumor has it that those dry faces still inhabit that house, living in our apartments instead of us. I don't know why the blind ones gravitated to these specific apartments. Perhaps they once belonged to them. I don't know, and I don't want to know. I just want to forget. But so far, it's proving difficult.